Committee Room 15.
And I'm delighted to welcome our panel, two online, but it's lovely to have Dr. Purdam with us in person as well. Would you like to introduce yourself, starting with Dr. Purdam?
Good morning. I'm Kingsley Purdam from the University of Manchester. I'm a researcher into issues around ageing and social participation amongst older people.
And we also have Professor Matt Padley and Dr. Juliet Stone. Would you like to introduce yourself first, Matt, if that's okay?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting us join online. I'm Matt Padley, one of the co-directors of the Centre for Research in Social Policy at Loughborough University. My research and the research of the Centre focuses on living standards broadly, and I've also done quite a lot of work on retirement living standards.
Fantastic. And Dr. Juliet Stone, also from Loughborough.
Hello, thanks. So I'm from the Centre for Research in Social Policy also, where I'm a research fellow. So do quite a lot of work on income adequacy generally, but I've also done some work in the past specifically on pensioner poverty and also on poverty at the end of life, which obviously affects.
Thank you. Could I very kindly ask you to speak up because we are getting you, but it's quite soft. And for old ears like mine, it would be okay. And I'm going to kick the questions off if that's all right. So obviously we're expecting the government to announce the second stage of the pension review, particularly looking at pension adequacy. And I wondered your views in terms of what the issues and problems the government's review should encompass and seek to address. So, for example, what's an adequate retirement income, how much people need to save, both in terms of the occupational or private pension on top of the state pension, how we address pension inequality, and so on. So who would like to kick that one off to start with?
Well, I can start and tell you a little bit about how our research relates to that. Okay. So this is an immediate issue and a growing issue amongst older people in their 50s and 60s, but the present pensioners are facing serious challenges, both economically, financially, but also more generally in their everyday lives. So there's some important challenges there, but it isn't only income that presents a challenge to older people. So it goes as wide as, say, feeling safe when you walk to the bus stop, say, or being housebound, or not having the support to go shopping or put a wash on, those kind of things. So there are wide-ranging challenges, and a telling comment from some of the work we do, we look at survey data from something, data set like the English Longitudinal Study of Ageing or the Wealth and Asset Survey, these gold standard surveys, but we also speak to older people as well. And so this telling comment from old woman aged 76 described how she felt she was punished for getting older. So there's some serious challenges that go beyond the issues of which specific benefits are being taken up or the value of those benefits, as important as that is.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Matt.
I think just to talk about adequacy and what that means, I think it's really important to ask questions about what the state pension should provide and how we're thinking about what adequate incomes in retirement look like. I think there are some kind of three dimensions of that. Kind of adequate for what? What is it? What is the living standard that we are hoping that pensioners can have in retirement, and how do we reach kind of consensus about what that looks like? A lot of our work focuses on that through our work on the minimum income standard, but also at a higher level through our work on the retirement living standard. But what is it that we think that the state pension should provide? I think that's a critical question. What should it enable people to do? I think there are also key questions about adequacy for when. So when we're thinking about adequacy of incomes in retirement, I think we often kind of separate that from adequacy of incomes across the life course. People don't just arrive at retirement and suddenly have enough money. So if we're thinking about income adequacy, it's really important that we think about people's incomes before retirement, and what we need to do to them in order to enable incomes in retirement to be adequate. You know, if you haven't got enough income during your working life, it's incredibly difficult to save enough to have an adequate income in retirement. And much as the state pension is valued, and does kind of provide a higher proportion of that minimum living standard established through our work, actually, I think we need to do more to look at adequacy across the board and across the life course, rather than just at these discrete points in time. And then adequacy for whom as well. I think that's a really critical question, with kind of demographic changes and changes in households and household compositions. Retired households don't look the same as they did 20, 30 years ago. An increase in multi-generational households, relationship breakdown later in life, all of these things kind of bring challenges to what that adequacy looks like and what sort of thing it's providing. One last point. I think we also need to think about adequacy beyond income. Okay. So often we're talking about whether or not what people have saved during their working life and the state pension, whether or not combined they are enabling people to have the money they need to have a certain type of living standard. But actually that's affected just as much by the costs that people face. So housing is clearly a critical one, and we know there are shifts away from private ownership later in life, and that brings real challenges if you have to pay housing costs throughout that retirement period. But also, always the elephant in the room when we talk about retirement, social care and the cost of social care. What do those costs mean for what might look like very adequate retirement incomes?
Thank you. Juliet, would you like to add to that?
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess I agree with everything the previous two panelists have said, but also just wanted to highlight the research that we've done with the end-of-life charity Marie Curie. So talking about inequalities, we looked at poverty at the end of life, which clearly affects pensioners more than working age people, although it does affect working age people. So we estimated around 90,000 pensioners died in poverty in 2023. And I think, sort of reiterating what Matt has said, in some ways, that this is partly about costs. So part of what we looked at there was fuel poverty at the end of life, and how people's energy needs, domestic energy needs, increase at certain points of the life course. So if they need particularly to have a warm home because their health will be affected by living in a cold home, they may have additional costs for running medical equipment. So I think it's about addressing those inequalities in costs as well, and particularly for those vulnerable groups who, for example, are in ill health. And this clearly overlaps with things like disability benefits as well. And I know that you are having a session in April that's specifically looking at health. So I guess it's just putting a flag there to have that as something to focus on.
Thank you very much.
Just on the kind of framing of adequacy, I find that quite sort of not very aspirational in terms of growing old. We wouldn't accept, you might accept an adequate partner or restaurant, but I don't really think that addresses some of the concerns older people have. The older people we speak to, I don't think they'd be sat around the room going, I hope I'm going to have an adequate old age. So there's much more to ageing, as I'm sure people know, beyond income. It's your social connections, it's how you are connected to your family, it's your health and the support you get, it's whether you can get a GP appointment, it's whether your house is damp. Now these things can be addressed through financial measures, but they go beyond that. So I think that's important to consider when you're reframing ageing, which I think needs to happen, because older people don't want to be seen as a burden, and they don't want a welfare system that labels them as a burden. They don't want to be vulnerable or seen as vulnerable, but they need the support, and that is about connecting up the support that exists, but also reframing how we view ageing. So ageing in place. So at the University of Manchester we do a lot of work on ageing in urban areas. We want people living in urban areas, accessing services, multi-generational, multi-age communities, and so that's more of a housing issue, a planning issue. It's not necessarily how much £5-10 here you're going to get on your pension or your pension credit. So I think that's really important. The framing of ageing, it's the UN decade of healthy ageing, as I'm sure you know. We're halfway through that. What is the UK doing to address those issues?
And that's a very, very valid point. I think probably a little bit beyond the scope, but I absolutely get the point that we need to be a more integrated and joined up government in our approach to this. Could I also ask, policy in practice has indicated there should be a slightly different approach to consider and separate issues for pensioners on lower incomes. Do you agree? Do you think that is something that we should be suggesting to the government to do?
Well, that organisation is very good at supporting local authorities trying to access more income or income that's not been claimed and targeting it. But benefits, or the policy design of a benefit where the take-up is so low, or lots of people who are applying who aren't eligible, so 50% of, I'm sure you know, of those recent applicants been declined. That's a failed policy. So take-up should be part of the design of policy. It should be, the policymakers should be called to question about take-up. So the research on take-up goes back to the 1980s. They've tried everything. This is to do with means-tested benefits, which perhaps you want to go on to. But we use the term anti, which is anti refers to awareness, unintended consequences, not recognising being in need, too complicated, and trust. And older people manifest those reasons for not claiming benefits they might be entitled to.
Okay.
And
Matt,
sorry.
I'm so sorry. Matt, Juliet, do you want to come in? I'm just conscious of time. I mustn't overstep.
I missed the question, actually. Sorry.
Policy and practice have indicated that the government's pension review, what they're calling the adequacy review, should consider it set slightly separately for the issue that we have around pensioner poverty and people on low incomes. And I wondered if you agreed or not.
I think the issues facing low-income pensioner households will also be faced by pensioner households who are higher up the income distribution. I think as Kingsley was saying, I think the targeting of benefits needs to work better. Is there a kind of magic answer to that, and how we do that? I don't think there is, unfortunately. But I think if we separate out particular income groups and treat them differently when we're thinking about the sort of retirement that they should have, or we're thinking about what they should be able to do in retirement, I think we run the risk that we end up with a kind of tiered system where one income group, we settle for less than we would do for kind of higher up the income distribution. So I'm not entirely sure that that's a good way of kind of structuring our thinking around this.
Okay, thank you. Juliet, do you want to add any final comments before I pass on to the next question?
Yeah, I'm just to again agree with the other panellists and sort of to build on what Matt was saying. I think it does run the risk of stigmatising means-tested benefits, and it might actually reduce take-up if you kind of put them in a silo separately from other pensioners. So yeah, I'd caution against it, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Jill German now.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, I agree wholeheartedly with the comments that have been made regarding income adequacy and what that means for pension adequacy. And indeed, issues such as just getting through the week and often putting your children first, and, just about managing through your day-to-day life and what's going on with your pension, even if it's on your mind, is not something that you feel like you can look towards. So I do think that that's something we need to look at. I think the pensions dashboard will help with that, but much more work to do. But I'd like to go back, if I can, to comments on housing and indeed health as intersectional issues. There's a number of voices saying that housing in particular is an issue. The Local Government Association have said that issues with health and housing are deeply entwined with the challenges that pensioners face. The Women and Equalities Committee has asked for a policy and data unit within the Cabinet Office looking at these cross-departmental challenges, and the Pensions Policy Institute have described housing tenure as a growing fracture. So I just wondered if we could delve deeper into that, and if you agree with those thoughts, and what an integrated approach would mean in practice.
Well, there is a growing concern about older people in the private rent sector, as I'm sure you know. So they're vulnerable to rent increases, and also hold to ransom by these, what I'd consider unscrupulous leaseholders, putting up service charges. I mean, it's quite clear that that is going on. And what do you do if you're an older person, if you're just about covering the rent, and then the leaseholder, there's annual fees go up? You can't magic money out from somewhere. And older people might not let their families know. They don't want to tell them they're struggling financially. They might have debts they've not told their families about. So housing is a crucial issue, and going to be increasing so, because we know about the profile of home ownership and how that is changing. Obviously, we know that amongst the old, the 85-year-olds, that's mainly women living on their own, widows, dealing with financial consequences of years of unpaid caring, bringing up their families maybe, or low-paid work, maybe have some part-time work, but so they're very vulnerable to any changes in the housing market.
I mean, clearly there are lots and lots of really critical questions around housing, like that extend beyond what we do for retired households and how we house people appropriately. I think there are some, radical things you could do. I think part of what Kingsley was saying about the value of community and the value of old people kind of remaining in urban centres, and that kind of links up with changes in expectations about what retirement looks like, which we've certainly picked up through the work that we do. It looks far more like working age now than it used to. That these kind of more innovative housing solutions that bring together young and old people, that are kind of multi-generational. I think there's some of that going on in Stockport. I heard Andy Burnham talking about it. Those kind of solutions to bringing together older people and younger people, creating intergenerational communities, so that people are kind of looking out for each other and looking after each other and kind of strengthening community ties. That goes some way to kind of addressing those issues with housing. But clearly there are kind of structural issues as well about housing stock and older households living in housing that isn't fit for their needs. There's that often repeated kind of statistic that most people who are wheelchair users don't live in housing that's appropriate for wheelchairs, and most people who live in housing that's appropriate for wheelchairs aren't wheelchair users. So there's clearly kind of challenges around what housing looks like. And then there's the cost as well. And if you are having to bear the cost of paying private rent or even social rent into retirement, and not necessarily getting full support for that through the benefit system, as income goes up, obviously that tapers off. Then that has an impact on the other sorts of things you can do, and may have an impact on your ability to actually just meet your essential needs as well.
Would you like to come in, Juliet?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Kingsley mentioned, which is gender. I think we can't ignore that if we're talking about intersectionality, and it does interact with housing and with health. We know that single female pensioners are the most likely of pensioners to be in poverty, and that is linked to the fact that they tend to be the older pensioners, skewed towards the older pensioners because of the longer life expectancy, obviously for women, but also going back to that kind of life course issue, that building up a pension pot, particularly for current pensioners, much less likely for female pensioners to have built up a decent pension pot. they're much less likely to have worked enough to claim the full state pension, so then are reliant on pension credit. As we know, uptake of pension credit is only about 2/3 of people who are eligible are actually receiving pension credit. And women are more likely to be in poor health in pension age than pension age men, with all the additional costs that then brings to light. So I think it's just to keep that in mind, that actually there is this gendered issue here, and it's something that we need to address kind of before people reach pension age.
Thank you, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I absolutely agree. There are many women in my direct experience who are absolutely in the situations you describe yourself. I myself cared full time for my children for many years, so there will be gaps there. You know, this is the reality of having caring responsibilities, and often, as you say, part-time work, and all the things that comes with being a woman in the workplace. Now, the Pensions Policy Institute says that the pension system needs to better reflect the range of individual circumstances, so things that we've touched on already: health, caring and working patterns. To what extent do you agree with this, and how should the adequacy review approach this? Start, Kingsley.
I can do. So we're faced with the population in its 80s, which was predominantly female, and so those support needs will vary between that cohort, but there will also be some things specific to women, and it's issues around personal care, loneliness, contact with the health visitors. I mean, that's quite rare these days. Access to GP support. So, for example, if you live in a damp home and you're fearful of putting the heating on, or as one of the older people we spoke to described, gets up every morning and looks at the meter to see how much it has gone up, so this constant surveillance of costs, then at best, if you're unwell, you're going to be admitted to hospital, and we know that older people dominate hospital admissions and also dominate hospital ward admissions. So how can that be a cost saving, given the costs of a hospital bed per night, compared to providing someone with an adequate, well-heated home and enough food to eat? It is a false economy.
Matt, Juliet, do you have any thoughts particularly on the range of issues to do with women, and the fact that people's lifestyles generally will be different leading up to pension age? What we could perhaps do to reflect an understanding of that?
Just add about this issue that comes up in relation to food insecurity, and possibly it's to do with men as well, but mothers and grandmothers food sacrifice, so they skip their meals, or they go to the food bank for their daughter or grandchildren, not for themselves. They're building up longer term health issues.
Anything to add finally, Juliet or Matt, on this question?
I just wanted to raise the issue of caring as well, which we have touched on, but that's not just about caring for dependent children. I think increasingly female pensioners in particular will take on a caring role, often for a spouse who is in ill health. And we know there are all sorts of issues with carers, informal carers being, unable to make ends meet. There are issues with carers allowance and with, the related benefits that come with that. And that, again, is disproportionately going to affect women, and women who are already in sort of stretched financial circumstances. So I think that we can't really think about pensioner poverty without actually thinking about caring as well.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, I think probably if we were designing the pension again, it wouldn't look like it currently does. But I think if we're thinking about what the system should do, it doesn't need to just be adequate. It needs to be sustainable, from a kind of public policy point of view and public spending point of view, but it needs to be equitable in terms of outcomes, I think, rather than in terms of kind of in terms of you pay in and what you get out. I think we need to make sure that we have a system that produces good outcomes across different age groups, across different genders, across different income groups, so that focus on equitable outcomes rather than kind of what people have put in and what they get out.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Jo Baxter, and colleagues, we're going to have to speed up a little bit. We're a wee bit behind, okay? Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So I guess the first question to Dr. Purdam. So your research has suggested that older pensioners, particularly women, think that people like them can't influence policy. Are they right on that? And if so, what's needed to ensure their rights and interests are reflected in policy making?
This was some research across Europe and in the UK, and there's lots of debate about intergenerational unfairness and those kind of issues, and how older people are more likely to vote. But actually there's a drop-off in voting when you get into your 80s. There's a detachment, and women in that 85 and older are less likely to vote than men in the same category, and they become detached and they feel like people like them. That's the survey question. It's quite awkward, but it's about putting yourself in the position that feel like they can't have an influence. So they're almost powerless in that sense, despite a stage in their life where they might have contributed national insurance, brought up the families. They're at a stage in life where they feel powerless. So who do older women go to when they're 85? Yeah, their partner's more than likely passed on. Yeah. So there's some strong evidence about this powerlessness, and there's barriers to voting for older women as well, older men, but it might be the complexity of postal voting or cognitive issues around that. We've picked up on some of those things. If you're isolated, you might become disconnected from the idea of voting. It becomes something that you're not involved with. So the evidence is quite striking, the difference between men and women in their 80s, but also that drop-off amongst older people. And a policymaker said to me, well, that's good, isn't it, Kingsley? We don't want older people voting. And I found that quite offensive, because we want these older people to be engaged. We need to know what services they need. We need to embrace ageing and support them, in their complex lives. A lot of older people's lives are quite simple, So there's an issue there, I think, that's come through the survey evidence, and we're looking now at the UK, because we looked across Europe, and that drop-off in voting amongst those aged 80 and over, and that is a growing population.
What do we need to do to make sure that their interests are better reflected in policy making? What's the answer to that issue that you've described?
Amongst the older women, it's striking, because we're looking at a century of suffragettes, and their parents and grandparents were amongst some of the first women to vote. So there's a passion for democracy and engagement. But what comes through is this kind of, I've had enough. One person said, I bet by the time you get to 90, I bet you give up. So, and that needs addressing, but I think that comes through a sense of who are they trusting, what sort of services have failed, and also the broader society around them, how confident they feel that, for example, is the post office closing.
So I guess to everybody on the panel then, in 2022 our predecessor committee called for the establishment of a new body to build and maintain an evidence base, explain the trade-offs in different policies and report regularly on progress in pensions adequacy. So the government at the time said that was not needed because there was already enough research. To what extent do you agree or disagree with that?
I think people need a reason to be engaged, don't they? And people need a reason to be engaged with policy and the political process more generally. And a lot of discussion, I guess, at a policy level, it doesn't necessarily directly relate to older people, particularly when this is not, things like social care are an issue that has been around for a long time, and there's been no answer to it. There's been no kind of movement on it, particularly for quite a while now. So I think we need people to be to feel like they're being talked to and talked about, and that their interests are being represented. And I think having clear advocates, so people who are kind of thinking not just about the adequacy of incomes in retirement, but about what retirement looks like. I think there's a risk if we focus too narrowly on, income adequacy in retirement, then we miss out on all that other important stuff that we've talked about this morning, like community, like housing, like what we do about the relationships between different generations, which are really critical in kind of ensuring kind of cohesion, which is a good thing, and kind of good community relationships, all the stuff that we all know lots about. But I think having someone who's responsible for gathering good evidence on that, and the best policy reflects the best, the best policy is made on the basis of really, really good evidence. So if we have really good evidence about what works in particular, with these kind of experiments around intergenerational housing, for instance, what are the outcomes of those in terms of health, in terms of how people feel, engaged in the world around them, and what can we do to kind of build those sorts of things, if they do work indeed, in other places? I think that is critically important. And actually that could be a really key role in advocating for, again, not just income adequacy, but thinking about retirement in the round.
Juliet, did you want to come in on that?
Nothing really to add to that, I don't think.
Just a very quick one then. How effective are models like the Older People's Commissioner in Wales and Northern Ireland? Is that a model that you think would be helpful?
I think it can only help as a sort of point of focus, because I don't think we're just thinking about income.
Yep.
So another issue, I don't know if you've got time for it, is we've been looking at funeral costs, and then they tend to fall to older women because they live longer. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge amount of funeral poverty, people not being able to afford to plan or pay for a funeral. And there's some issues around older people taking up the funeral expenses payment benefit as well, which links to other things. But some sort of point of focus, I think, would be a good start.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jill German.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about how we compare to other countries. So the UK state pension, does it stack up? Are we doing well? Are there other countries doing better than us? I just wondered what your understanding of that was. If I could start with Matt, please.
This is the point at which I say I'm not really an expert on other countries' pensions. But I do know there was a big review of pensions adequacy across the EU fairly recently. And there are lots of countries who are facing the same kind of questions around the adequacy of incomes in retirement, with rising costs across the board. But the extent to which state pension systems actually meet those needs, I think there's been a perception, certainly across Europe, that they are meeting those to a greater extent. But whether or not that's actually true in terms of the kind of changes, the demographic changes in costs, all those things. But yes, it's not an area that I am massively expert in. So
Fair
sorry.
enough. Who wants to take it next then? Who would consider themselves more of an expert?
Well, it's a difficult comparison because of the variations in cost of living, population size, etc. But in a general sense, you'll have seen the World Happiness Report, and obviously we'd all be happy if we lived in Finland, which is a much smaller country. But in terms of pensioners, in terms of those measures, income wasn't one of the key measures there. It was about your social connections, your ability to say, for example, in the food poverty work we've done, can you afford to have the neighbour round for tea? So that would show up in the World Happiness Measure, but wouldn't show up necessarily in some other approaches to making sure people are ageing well. So across countries, I think there's huge variation, essentially. So there's no perfect approach, but there's good practice to draw on, particularly around housing, I think, and intergenerational communities, and how older and younger people and families can live in much more integrated ways that are supported by, say, for example, sustainable transport, accessible shops, these kind of things, safe spaces where older people feel safe walking between places. They don't feel intimidated by groups of young people on the corner, say, these kind of things, because that is the community they live amongst.
Juliet, do you have anything to add?
I think this probably isn't my area either, so I'll pass on.
Fair enough, thank you.
Just to add, actually, if you look at one of the key measures in terms of how ageing is different across countries, if you look at the level of healthy lived years, healthy life expectancy and life expectancy. So if we wanted to use that measure, that's quite interesting, because obviously the UK is a certain amount lower than other countries and also across regions. So I'm from Manchester, and if you look at healthy life expectancy and life expectancy there's a 10-year gap.
Indeed. I'm going to hand over to John Mill now.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to explore whether you think the government has a clear rationale and objective for the state pension. For example, the aim of the Pensions Commission reform was to help people achieve a percentage of working life income in retirement, for example, a replacement rate of 45% for median earners. Do you think that's still the right approach? Or alternatively, what might be the pros and cons of, for instance, setting targets based on retirement living standards? Juliet, if you'd like to kick off.
Thank you. Yeah, I think to pick up on some of the things we've talked about already, I think it's really difficult to have that kind of fixed sort of target of 25% to build up a pot for 25% of your working income, for example, when people's circumstances over their life courses, particularly as we've highlighted for women, are for a lot of people going to make that really challenging. So I think going back to what Matt was saying earlier, I think we should be focusing on outcomes here rather than on what people are putting in. And from my perspective, that it would be a much more equitable way of having a target. So I think we should be thinking about what kind of life do we want people to be having when they reach pension age.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, you started, I think, with the question, what's the state pension for? And that kind of inevitably leads to the question, and then, how should we think about the level at which it's set? I think more broadly, across the whole benefit system, having a clearer idea of what it is that we are aiming to provide and the kind of standard of living that we are aiming for when we're supporting people either in retirement or through working life, as a kind of guiding principle, is useful. If what we're doing is rather piecemeal and particularly kind of separating life out into these stages that absolutely run into each other and more run into each other. So working lives extend, far beyond where they used to, and people are still working into retirement. My dad still insists on marking A-level exams at the age of 83. When he doesn't need to. But, working life has changed. And I think our understanding of how the state pension fits in with that needs to change, and it needs to reflect the kind of changing world around us. People are working, possibly because they want to, possibly because they feel they need to. How do we take that into account? There's been some value, I think, in having the national living wage and kind of having a target for setting that at a particular percentage of median income. Is there value in doing the same thing for pensions? Maybe. I don't think it should be pegged to retirement living standards. As the person who's responsible for the retirement living standards research, I think they are intended as useful guidance in people's thinking about the sort of retirement they want as individuals, rather than being or functioning as kind of targets for the state pension, for example. But I do think, again, going back to what I said at the start, having that kind of guiding principle about what it is that we want the benefit system in general, but the state pension more specifically, what we want it to do, what we want it to enable, touching on all sorts of things we talked about this morning, like community, combating loneliness, all those sorts of things. I think that those kind of fundamental questions are really, really important in kind of guiding whatever decision that we make about the value of the state pension.
Thank you, very interesting. Kingsley, anything to add to that?
I think the minimum income standard, which is, I'm sure you know, has been developed, is a good baseline to think about how much resources people are going to need in old age. Obviously, there's always unexpected costs, and for a lot of people on low pay in their 50s, they can't afford, or they might not have place pension, and they might have gaps in their contributions. But I think it goes beyond this issue of how much money you've got. If society is a bit more orientated around a positive narrative of ageing, you don't need as much money. Yeah? If you're supported in different aspects of your daily life as an older person, then the difference between a few percentage points in terms of income isn't going to make a massive difference. But the minimum income standard, which I'm sure other academics can talk about, does set a framework for saying, actually, okay, this is an idea of ageing which will give me a sense of well-being, a certain quality of life. Because when you speak to older people, they might talk about money a little bit, but they talk about all the things they interact with first.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Steve Darling now.
Thank you. If I can start off with on this first question of mine. So I just really wanted, we've already unpicked this to a certain extent, but the cost of either mortgage or more and more now rent is not taken up in account of when you're considering retirees' living standards. We've already unpicked that. Where else would you go around that housing challenge? And also, I think some of the panel have talked about cohabiting opportunities, different ways of actually older people living, and a more enriched approach to retirement. That sounds very interesting. That if you can explore that as well.
Yeah. So just to go back to the minimum income standard a minute, and then I will come to the retirement living standards. And that's only because the minimum income standard provides the basis for our work on retirement living standards. So within that, the kind of public are clear that older people living in social housing kind of meets that minimum housing need. And there was a point at which that was absolutely fine, and everyone could access social housing, and social housing was generally appropriate for older people. That is changing, and over the course of the past nearly 20 years of doing research on minimum living standards, those views have changed. When we took that same approach to ask the public to define those retirement living standards above that minimum, there was still an assumption, or still, the public thought it was a reasonable assumption that in retirement, people could reasonably expect to own their own home. But we absolutely know that's changing. But that's why the retirement living standards, as they're reported, don't include housing costs, because it's based on what the public think are reasonable assumptions. However, as you rightly say, where there are housing costs in retirement, they pose significant challenges often. And it's not just those kind of direct housing costs. So we know an increasing number of people have mortgages going into retirement or beyond retirement age. We know that increasing numbers of people are living in the private rented sector, which doesn't just bring challenges around cost, but as Kingsley had talked about, the kind of quality of housing, which I think we really need to think about more than, or we need to think beyond the cost of housing to actually what sort of state housing is in. So, I think it's inevitable that if you're paying for those housing costs, then that will have an impact, and often a detrimental impact, on what you're able to do and the quality of your life more generally. I think there are really interesting things happening when it comes to kind of building housing that works for generations. I've had conversations in the past year around with people who are involved in building kind of retirement villages, which aren't just for older people, but include housing for kind of multi-generational housing. So what you're doing is intentionally building new communities that bring together working age people and children and older people, and valuing the role of older people within communities. Again, and much of this goes beyond, any numbers or any kind of income. It's about kind of valuing what older people can bring to communities, as well as making sure that things like loneliness, which are absolutely crippling for lots of old people, are combated in ways that are based on community rather than kind of spending money on that problem. I think the last point is that there's a real clear role for services here, and if we improve services, improve public transport and the kind of the accessibility of that, then we have an impact on outcomes, and we have an impact on the adequacy of incomes. Not by giving people more money, but by making or improving the kind of services that make life kind of easier and better day to day.
Juliet?
I think the key thing here for me is giving people choice. So this is one of the things that underlies our minimum income standards, kind of our definition of what is a socially acceptable standard of living, is that people should have not endless choice, but should have some element of choice. And I think at the moment with housing, people have very little choice about where they end up. They're relying on, if they're in the private rental sector, which, as we know, increasingly people approaching retirement are relying on the private rental sector, the quality of housing they can access, where that housing is, and how much it costs are really, really limiting their housing choices. And I think these kind of developments we've been talking about, where you're getting these sort of intergenerational sort of villages, if you like, I think that's great as an option, but I think we shouldn't assume that that's what everybody wants. Not everybody is going to want to live in that kind of environment. So I think trying to make sure that people still have a choice about where and how they're living is really important.
Thank you. Kingsley, any reflections?
You've reminded me of this work we did in a sheltered housing block of flats where there was just one man there. And when it came to lunchtime, he'd take his lunch upstairs and eat it in his room. And it reminds me, we can't be naive about these things. Older people have personality conflicts, they don't get on with people. So we need to respect, as Juliet says, it can't have this kind of fantasy, perfect world. Older people have their own issues and relationship challenges. So I think there's scope, in terms of urban design and urban ageing, there's scope for more integrated housing, because we don't want older people isolated living on their own. Now I think there's been a bit of a step change with the winter fuel payment, and perhaps before then, that local authorities are now increasingly able to identify those older people at risk. And I think empowering local authorities, they've sort of demonstrated by the way they've backfilled the winter fuel payment withdrawal by saying, right, we're going to go and find these vulnerable older people, we're going to put some other things in. So I think that in terms of empowerment, that is a possible way forward, because we need to know who these older vulnerable people are, and they're mainly women, and they're mainly isolated, and poverty, their pension and the pension credit isn't getting to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Pinto-Duchinsky.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for sharing your testimony so far. One of the issues that Matt raised early on was the fact that poverty once one reaches pensionable age is often driven by poverty before one reaches pensionable age. And one of the patterns that certainly some people have pointed out is around an increasing spike of people who are in poverty in the years leading up to their pensionable age. So the Fabian Society said that there's been a significant increase in poverty among people aged 60 to 64, driven largely by increases in the state pension age. What do you think this implies for the patterns of pensioner poverty in future? And Matt, maybe we could start with you.
I think yes, there have been. Juliet might be better placed to talk about some of this than I am, but I think kind of accessing employment opportunities in that period in life is difficult. Continuing to save into a pension pot, if you've been saving into a pension pot, is difficult. That reduces the income you're likely to have in retirement, so it has consequences for your retirement standard, and the amount of your pension. You may well have to use up savings. I don't think any of that is going to disappear anytime soon. I think with the increases in the pension age, I think it's more likely to happen. But then I think the way in which, what work looks like and what working lives look like, as I touched on earlier, I think is changing. And there's evidence to suggest that. Is that what we want, we being society? Do we want people to have to work for longer in order to kind of maintain that standard of living? Is it inevitable when we have these huge demographic shifts and, the increases in life expectancy, which have slowed down recently, haven't they? But still, we're still well above where it was before. Is it just an inevitable consequence of that actually we are all going to have to work longer. And is that the kind of society we want? I think it's really important that we do things to support that group, but then supporting that group into employment is not straightforward. So I think there's a real challenge there around the sorts of challenges and issues that kind of older worker group are facing in particular. But Juliet may well have some more interesting things to say than me on that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Juliet. And Juliet, can I also ask, as you comment on that, could you also comment on which groups you think are particularly affected by this trend?
So I think thinking about the kinds of work that people are now doing and how that's changed over time, I think there's much more of a trend towards precarious employment now. Very few people now are going to be having a job for life, as it's called. And increasingly, as those people age through the population, that's going to become a massive issue. I think people doing the kinds of work where there's a kind of physical element to it, that becomes increasingly difficult as you become older for a lot of people. You know, as if their ability deteriorates and they're going to be less able to do the kind of work that they did when they were 30 once they reach 60. So those groups are going to be particularly vulnerable, I think. There's also some work that I'd like to highlight to bring it back to the issue of caring. So a project that I was involved with looking at people who were caring for somebody at the end of life in their household, which would tend to be a spouse again. And there was an increasing likelihood that they would take early retirement from their work because they had these caring responsibilities. And as the retirement age increases, that is going to become more of an issue, that people are not going to be able to work until they reach retirement age because they have other responsibilities. And again, I think reforming this whole system around kind of benefits, including benefits for people providing informal care and the role of social care within that, again, we can't ignore that as part of this picture.
And can I ask, presumably, I mean, you've mentioned two different groups of people who are unable to undertake hard physical labour on the one hand, and then people with caring responsibilities. How does that break down from a gender point of view? Is that presumably, does this particularly affect women to men? What is the pattern?
So the caring responsibilities would definitely be more affecting women. That is clearly very much skewed towards women. I think probably increasingly there's less of a gender divide in terms of the kinds of work. I think because the sort of nature of work is changing, we're sort of moving away from those more industrial kind of sort of businesses. And actually quite a lot of women are doing work, things like cleaning, where actually it is quite physical. So I think there's less of that divide now between sort of non-manual and manual labour in terms of gender, although probably still slightly more skewed towards men.
Fantastic. Kingsley, do you have anything to add?
I think they're a really important group, the pre-retirement women and men for that matter, because the level of financial insecurity is higher amongst that group, particularly those who've spent their lives on low income. So we did some work observing debt interviews, and the levels of debt amongst women in their 60 and 64 are higher than other groups. The level of economic abuse by partners is higher, and they're very much juggling low-paid part-time work with care and responsibilities. So that group, I don't know how you could target them, but it's not going to be an easy fix because they've spent a lifetime on low income and they're faced with a predatory market. So we've been through a sort of years of high interest cash loans, and we've moved away from that a bit. But that was indicative of the position those women in particular were in. So any support to that group would be helpful. But the UK labour market's very segregated in terms of gender, and so we did some work a long time ago about if you phone for a plumber, you should be a 50-50 chance you get a woman plumber. Yeah, but that's unrealistic, and it hasn't happened because of the segregation of the labour market. Part-time women, generally low paid.
Can I ask one final question before I hand back to the chair? You mentioned that women aged 60 to 64 are more at risk of abusive financial relationships. What's the driver of that? Is that relationship breakdown? What's going on there?
Well, it goes back to male breadwinner role. Female incomes in a household have been shown to be seen as less important, more of a kind of, oh, that's a little top up, where the male income's seen as the important income, that's traditionally. And then there's evidence that a lot of men hide different aspects of financial issues in a house, whether it's separate bank accounts or credit cards or those kind of things. And it sometimes it's only revealed after the man dies and those financial issues are confronted. The woman has to confront.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And over to Jo Baxter again.
So I think this issue about ensuring people have adequate incomes in the lead up to retirement is obviously very important. So Juliet and Matt, I think your 2024 research found that households looking for work or unable to work were much less likely than pensioners to meet the minimum income standard. Is that differential justified?
I mean, this is something that we see all the time. However, we kind of sort of describe poverty or living standards, that people of working age are much less likely to have an adequate income, however that's defined, than people of pension age. And it is very much to do with the value of working age benefits as opposed to the state pension. So not to kind of say, well, that's fine, then the state pension is, the benchmark, so, fine, we'll ignore the pensioners. But I think when you compare the two, the amount that people get, for example, on universal credit, if they're looking for work, is much lower than people get on when they're at pension age. And for me, that I don't think that is justified. Because it actually, we're basically saying that people of working age, their lives are of less value than people of pension age almost, that they don't need as much, when actually a lot of those people probably have more outgoings than people of pension age. So I think we do need to look at both. And I think, as we've talked about throughout all of this, you can't necessarily separate the two. Because the kinds of lives that people have, whether they're able to save during their working lives, that's going to affect their pension. Are they able to pay into a private pension? If their incomes are too low to be able to do that, then that they're not going to have an adequate pension. And I think also, just to move it away slightly from just looking at people who are out of work, it's also the case that people who are in low paid work during working age, who often will be receiving some element of universal credit as well, those people also are not going to be as well off as people in pension age a lot of the time. So there is definitely this disparity there, and yeah, it's something that needs to be addressed.
Just to reflect on, if you look at the adequacy of the state pension over time relative to the minimum income standards, so what it is that the public agree everyone needs for that minimum standard of living, that's declined over time, but not as rapidly as the value of out of work benefits, for instance, relative to that same standard. And I think that there are, so something that comes out very clearly in all of our conversations as part of the retirement living standards research is exactly this challenge that there is this, and it persists. There's the idea that in retirement, retirement will be better because people are looking forward to having the state pension because that gives them some sense of security that out of work benefits when they're working just simply don't. And that doesn't mean that it in itself is adequate, but there is that kind of that security that's provided by it, and then being able to maybe access more support for housing and those sorts of things. I do think we need to, again, to kind of to emphasise the point that Juliet made, that I think we need to think about income adequacy across the life course. And I don't think it's right that we're shifting an awful lot of that responsibility to work and paid work away from the support that people receiving the support they genuinely need to cover whatever cost that they're facing. And obviously there's a lot of discussion at the moment around disability benefits, but in terms of children, and we've seen what's happened with support for children and the cost of raising children over recent years as well. I'm not going to sit here and argue that the state should be meeting all those costs, because I don't think it should. And I also don't think that the state pension should be set at despite the fact that we do the minimum income standard work, I wouldn't argue that the state pension should provide everyone with that minimum income standard. I think there is a role for saving through auto-enrolment, and we've seen the kind of success of that, but the value of that is not sufficient for most people when they reach retirement. So again, I think a lot of this goes back to those bigger questions about what we're trying to do, and the principles that we have that kind of guide all of our decision making about what the state pension should do, but also about what benefits for working age people should do as well.
What changes would you prioritise to address this? Because, I mean, I think Juliet's absolutely right. I mean, you know, if you've got that lower income before retirement, at whichever stage, it's going to impact on your retirement, the pension that you've got in retirement. So what's the solution?
I think looking at auto-enrolment rates and the level of auto-enrolment and the contributions from employers as well as from employees, I think that might be something that's worth looking at. I think costs as well. So this isn't, you know, we talk about incomes a lot, but what can we do about costs that mean that the active incomes you need to have that minimum living standard aren't as high? There's particular concerns that come out in our latest research around the cost of healthcare in particular, and having to access services that would, you know, 10 years ago, people would have expected to access through the NHS, and not being able to do that now because of waiting times. And, you know, if you need physio to sort your back out so you can go to work, you need physio now. You don't need, you know, you can't wait 12 weeks in order to do that, because then you're losing income and so on. And, you know, they kind of, it mounts up. So I think, yeah, looking at auto-enrolment, looking at costs, and looking at, I mean, ultimately the value of the support that people receive.
Thank you.
John Mill, and if we can make it very succinct, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And this is a set of questions for Juliet, because they're relating to your report. The Social Security Advisory Committee felt there was a tension, or even a contradiction, between the expected exchequer saving from the change in winter fuel payment eligibility on the one hand, and the cost of increasing pension credit take-up on the other hand. Do you think that was a fair thing to say?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I think that anything that increases uptake of pension credit is, from my perspective, a good thing, because I think, as we've heard, that people have been trying to do that for a long time, and actually this seems to have been the one thing that has increased people applying for pension credit. But in the work that we did, we looked at the sort of wider costs to society of people not claiming pension credit, and particularly focusing on healthcare. So we looked at, so we used sort of administrative data on sort of the costs of a hospital stay and sort of the cost of prescriptions for people over 65, and used survey data to kind of model what difference it would make if people were claiming pension credit where they were eligible, and what difference that would make to their risk of being below 60% of median income. I won't go into the technical details given the shortage of time, but effectively we showed that it was costing about £4 billion a year to the healthcare service and to social care, because people weren't claiming pension credit. So I think that actually it could save money ultimately if we think, and this was only looking at healthcare and social care. There are obviously other things that it could have a knock-on effect on as well. So actually, I think for me, that increased uptake of pension credit is a good thing. I wouldn't necessarily say that I agree with the way that the changes to the eligibility for the winter fuel payment have been implemented, but I think as a sort of positive consequence of it, I think, yeah, I would say that is a good thing.
Thank you. And your research from 2020 suggested that if everyone were to take up pension credit, for every £1 spent on benefit, there could be a £2 saving in health and social care costs. Can you explain the basis for that assessment?
Yep. Okay. So we use the survey data from Understanding Society. I'll give you an example. So looking at acute hospital care. So what we were able to do was to, assuming that for every percentage point increase in their percentage of median income, that was working in a linear way. So for every percentage point increase in percentage of median income, that they would that their risk of going to hospital would reduce. So we could kind of model that over looking at the sort of gradient there. So then model how many fewer days in hospital there would be if people's incomes increased because they had pension credit. And then we did that again for primary care and again for social care. And also did some other work looking, comparing local area data, so looking at the local authority spending in those areas and comparing that with rates of non-take-up of pension credit in those areas, and again did some modelling there. And our sort of central estimate was that the saving was about £4 billion.
Thank you. And you also noted that there was evidence, although there was evidence for the health impacts, there was little on the wider societal costs of pensioner poverty. Do you think that's still the case?
I think we didn't really look at the wider societal costs in that work. I know in previous work they have looked at that. I think it depends on what we mean by wider societal costs. I think the things that we've been talking about today in terms of kind of social isolation and in terms of kind of participating in society, it's quite difficult to monetize those. So if we're doing anything like a cost benefit analysis, actually monetizing those things is really difficult. And I would possibly move away for those things from thinking about the benefits in terms of savings in financial terms. I think it's too often we kind of focus on that and don't think about actually what we're interested about here is people's well-being, their ability to live with dignity. And actually, I know that there are ways that people do monetize those, but I'm not necessarily saying that that's the way to go. I think those are positive outcomes in and of themselves that we shouldn't ignore.
Thank you. And then finally, Policy and Practice said it would like to be able to measure the fiscal savings to local authorities from increased take-up. Do you think we've got the evidence base to enable that sort of analysis? And if not, what would we need to do to build it up?
I think some of the evidence is there. I think what we probably need is to have a bit more of a joined up system. I think even within sort of Department for Work and Pensions, I know that, you know, there are different kind of teams working on different things who I've had some interaction with. And even within departments, there's sometimes a lack of clarity as to what each team is doing. And then if we're looking at cross-departmental communication, you know, that again is another issue. We've already seen that, you know, benefits, incomes, healthcare, housing, you know, all these things are interacting. So I would argue that actually what we really need is a cross-departmental approach to this. And perhaps something like the Pensioners Commissioner might be a way of bringing that together.
Thank you very much indeed, Noel.
Thank you. And a very quick one from Frank.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very quick and I will only ask one question. Obviously, we know the figures that show that there's up to £23 billion per year of unclaimed benefit, and an estimated £8 billion in pension credit is going unclaimed now. Kingsley, you have produced a lot of research with regards to the reasons for that, and there's been a running theme throughout this morning on that, so I won't touch on that specifically, but taking into consideration the research that you have undertaken, what would you say would be a key component of a strategy to successfully increase the uptake in pension credit? And would you say that there are gaps in government and its agencies' understanding about what constitutes effective practice in this regard, given the historic levels of underclaiming?
With take-up, I think almost everything's been tried, from celebrities to letters with different interventions, behaviour change approaches, but it's an entrenched issue, and the research goes back to the 80s. DWP tried, where you would have an automated payment, and then the person would say, do you want, and then they would be asked if they want to continue, and that didn't really work. The most convincing intervention is face-to-face support. Know the older people. This is why I mentioned about local authorities getting to know their vulnerable older people more, and maybe through some funding mechanism they could be incentivised to do that. So across Manchester, there's lots of modelling about different local authorities and take-up rates, say, for example, in Oldham, and how that compares across different local authorities. But it's not specific to pension credit. So as I mentioned earlier, funeral expenses payment, there's a lack of take-up in there, and it's similar in other countries. So there's a range of reasons. As I said, we use the phrase anti to talk about awareness, not recognising being in need, too complicated trust. People fear that if they fill in a form, they might lose some of their income they've already got. They don't want to take that chance. And then you've got that disengagement from not being awarded anything. So there's a lot of distrust. And the one thing I wanted to mention in relation to funerals and funeral expenses payment is the rise in public health funerals. And I was shocked to find out that some local authorities put the names of people and the home address and the expense of that funeral on their websites as some kind of approach to transparency. That is adding to the perceived stigma and shame of how we treat older people. And so that also, the complexity of the funeral expenses payment, which is means tested benefit, has been argued that's leading people to opt for a public health funeral. Public health funerals where the local authority has a responsibility to pay for that. So it's an entrenched problem. I don't think we're getting to the most vulnerable people. Pension credit's really important. The form's complicated. You need help. The help's not there to fill those forms in.
So face-to-face, that's your big...
If you look at the literature, and there's a lot of it, I must say, little case studies or researchers by government departments over the years, what comes out, I think, is that it's a face-to-face hand-holding vulnerable person to complete the form. And sometimes it's someone's daughter, but there's always some sort of advice point in there, and that seems to have disappeared a little bit. What we could do, and I think because pension credit has got lots of health-linked things to it, is integrate it into healthcare, because a lot of the associated benefits are health benefits, and the outcomes of not claiming pension credit are health issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to call a halt there, but I'm very, very grateful to all our panellists for giving their evidence today. It's been incredibly interesting, but we're going to have to move on now to our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to our second panel for this evidence session on the pension and poverty inquiry. And we have with us today Daphne Hall from the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors, Gary Vaux, Head of Hertfordshire Money Advice, and Gareth Morgan from Ferret Information Systems. So a warm welcome to you. I'm going to kick off if that's okay. We heard from the first panel about the adequacy of support for pensioners through the state pension system. I saw you there listening intently. What do you think are the main issues that welfare rights and money advisors are seeing, and how this compares to what perhaps is being collected in the evidence at an academic level?
I think take-up's a key thing, because there is support there within the means-tested benefit system, but it's not being used. So there's a pension credit take-up, which we've talked about, and I'm sure we'll come back to. But there's also the other benefits like attendance allowance, which people don't realise. People even say the name of it, they don't realise that it's a disability benefit. It's for someone who's disabled. They think it's for somebody who's caring because you're attending somebody. Carers allowance is very complex for pensioners because they can't, generally if they've got a state pension, they can't get carers allowance, but they have to claim it to get underlying entitlement to then get them extra bit on pension credit. That's incredibly complex. They could very simply put into pension credit a carer element similar to universal credit, where you just need to say, I'm caring for somebody who's getting a disability benefit for 35 hours, job done. So I think there's a lot of complexities in the system that don't need to be there, and those are adding to it. But I know we're short for time, so I'm going to let others come in if you want to.
Thanks very much. Certainly, I almost wanted to come in at the end of the previous panel, because the issue of what works, and I mean, I've been involved in welfare rights advice work for 35, nearly 40 years. And in that time, I've seen what works. And what works are boots on the ground. It's people out there talking to clients, persuading them to claim. Yeah. You know, the take-up of pension credit has started at 62% when it was introduced. I think it's risen to the massive heights of 65% over a 20-year period. You know, as we heard, they've tried everything. Well, everything except getting Martin Lewis to promote it, I think. But other than that, we've tried publicity. What works, and I've been talking to people in Lancashire who've done some incredible work around this. People in Durham have done some very good work indeed as well. I've been talking to them and in my own authority. What works is contacting people and offering them that support, because it was interesting during the whole issue around winter fuel payment that when pension credit was promoted, and was promoted, you know, very heavily, it soon became, oh well, the claim form is 24 pages long and there's 225 questions on it, which technically is true. And that became in itself a reason why people didn't claim. It's too complicated. We never got the message across, except when you actually work directly with people, that of those 225 questions, 200 of them were probably irrelevant. So it's getting people who are trusted. We've been looking at social prescribers. We've been looking at community navigators. GPs have got a very big role to play. If they prescribed somebody pension credit, if they gave somebody a pad and said, take this to your local advice service, you know, and prescribed it almost, it would get people into those advice services. So I think that's the biggest issue. And we can't have a system where we're effectively putting out a public message which says, at the moment, claiming benefits is bad, but actually claiming this benefit is good. Yeah. You know, pensioners pick up both of those messages at the same time, and it's counterintuitive then to many people to think, well, if claiming benefits is bad for the country, claiming pension credit must be as well. And you can't give those mixed messages.
Yeah. Do you think it's easy enough to identify from a local authority perspective who the people are they need to contact?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data is there. It's usually accurate, but data only works if you can actually make use of it. Yeah. We might know the 35% of pensioner households who are not claiming, but saying to them, oh, you're one of the 35%, please claim. So what? You know, it's moving on from knowledge to action that really counts.
Gareth?
If I can but I've been around as long or longer as Gary, I think, and like him, I was nodding at the end of the last session when the speaker was talking about the secret is face-to-face, and that really is it. I'd like to point to the Welsh Government's project on Dangos, which is ongoing. That's taken an approach of trying to increase face-to-face, not in terms of getting detailed advice, problem-solving to people, but of raising the awareness of what they call frontline workers about what financial help and support is available, not to turn them into advisors, but just to raise their awareness. And frontline workers is a very broad term there. It covers housing support officers and social workers, everybody, but it goes as far as saying police community support officers, hairdressers, anybody that meets people face to face. And they've been for 3 years now, or 4 years, raising the awareness of these people through free online training and so forth. They've raised, I think, the awareness of over 6,000 people in those 3 years, and all of the evidence that's coming back from that is that those people are sharing that awareness with the people they talk to on a day-to-day basis. They have information that tells them where to refer them to, where to signpost them to when that expert advice, like Gary's team would have, is available. And all of this stuff that's showing on the outcomes is very, very positive. Well over half those people are using that information day to day, and a very high proportion of the people that they see are also using that because they're known to them and they're trusted. Yes. And it is that secret that they're not a cold, impersonal envelope. They are somebody that they can talk to.
Okay, Daphne, very quickly wanted to come
Yeah,
in.
I was just so one of the advice is social landlords is another way in as well, because they tend to know their tenants. So just really briefly.
Very good. I have another couple of questions, but I'm going to see how we get on for time. So I'm going to hand over now to Amanda Hagg.
Hello. So we obviously have had 2 panels running today, and one of the things that we wanted to delve down into is the challenges that you see faced by people that are aged 60 up to pensionable age, who are not in paid work or are struggling to get that full-time work. Have you seen that change as there's been raises in the state pension?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And I think somebody was talking earlier, I think it was about the people who've been in physical labour jobs. So, like, you know, like if you've been in a builder all your life, the chance of you still being able to do it into your 60s are quite limited because it's just hard labour, basically. So there's some of that. There's the state pension age going up. I think it's also very relevant mixed age couples. Yeah. So within universal credit, so you might have people well into their 70s who are on working age benefit. And that's really increased poverty, I think, there, definitely. And just perhaps moving into the ones where, so on the converse of that, there are pensioners who would like to work and do work, but they lose all their income, all but £5 or £10 of their income, because that's the way pension credit works. So it's trying to make the ones who can't work, but also the ones who can work, enabling them to work and bring themselves out of poverty by doing that.
I think there's a generation of and it's predominantly women in the mid-50s upwards, I would say, who are squeezed. They're squeezed by, in many cases, still providing childcare for grandchildren, and have still got elderly parents. As life expectancy goes up into the 80s, you know, we've got people in their 60s who are carers for people in their 80s, and we see that very frequently. And their options for working are very limited indeed if they're squeezed between those two responsibilities, and in some cases both of them at the same time. So I think what it then does, and we heard earlier that squeeze on their income at that point becomes significant. And if I remember some of the data from the recent Get Britain Working research, was there's been a very substantial increase in, a lot of the focus has been on the under 35s with an increase in sickness benefit claims. In fact, there's been I think 900,000 increase in those in the 55 to 64 range claiming benefits as sick because they're sick. You know, that's their coping mechanism for the pressures that they're under.
I'd come back to the mixed-age couples issue as a particularly important one. When the older person was the person that qualified for pension credit, then there was much less of a gap between somebody retiring, ceasing work, and being able to move on to their supported pension there. With the mixed-age couple rules, we now see a lot of people who, the elder person, perhaps typically the man, stops working, the earnings have disappeared, but the support has not appeared. There is that huge gap between when they stop working and when they become entitled to that higher amount. You can't even really use your pension savings very properly in that situation. If you're on a working age benefit because your income is low, then taking money from your pension savings, which would be ignored if they're untaken for working age claims, but once you take them, as Daphne said, it's penny for penny reduction from your benefit. So if you need that extra money, the first thing you've got to do is to lose the amount of benefit that you would be getting from the money you're taking.
Thank you. And obviously we're due to see another uplift in the pensionable age between 2026 to 2028. So what support do you think you'd like to see from the government to consider for those unable to continue working up to 67?
I mean, I think I'd definitely come back to the mixed age couples, because that's the thing, it distorts it. It's not just up to 67, it's up to the younger partner is 67. I think the average age gap is something like 8 years. I'm plucking out of my head, so that might be wrong. But, you know, that's huge, isn't it? So that's people up to 75 living off, I mean, it was mentioned earlier, the universal credit levels are very low. And whether there could be some adjustment on something like that for where there's a pensioner in the household. And as Gareth says, that pension thing, the pension's almost worthless. So you've made that savings. But, I mean, even the people going up to 67, there are going to be a significant number that can't work. And Gary was quite right as well, and people retiring early because they're caring. More and more you see that caring for elderly relatives. Not, I mean, it might be a spouse, but often an elderly relative. And because they can't cope, you know, and whatever. So, anyway, I'm going on again. I'm going to let you come in.
I think the issue with the extension up to 67 and possibly even beyond is that we'll see a widening of the gap between those who are in work and pensioner poverty. You know, I'm over that age myself and I'm still working, so I'm doing very well, frankly, at the moment. And I think there are a cohort of people who are in that position of where you carry on working and either you can afford to retire when you're 60 or 63 or 65 or earlier, or you can carry on working till you're 70. And they're doing relatively well. But the ones who can't work beyond that, I'm in a non-labour intensive job, a non-physical job. If I was in a physical job, you see, I wouldn't be able to do it. And I think that would be so true of many people in that, as the pension age goes up, there's going to be many, many people who don't have the option of carrying on working and will be relying on pension age benefits.
And that's the case, isn't it? It makes it worse for longer. And I think one of the things we need to remember as well, particularly about poorer people, is that longevity is not so much a problem for them. Longevity is a problem for wealthy people, because they're the ones who are going to live longer and more healthily. Poorer people don't. Poorer people live shorter lives and less healthy lives. So they're much less likely to be able to make use of that support than people getting kind of the equivalent taxable benefits, whatever they might be, who are better off. So the poorer people are seeing their support shortened, if you like, because they're not going to have the extension in longevity that perhaps better off people will.
And one very quick thing, just with the proposals to reduce the health element in universal credit, that's going to impact massively on that older age group. I mean, they're looking at getting people into it, but for those people who have come to the end of their working life, that's a halving proposed of that, the health element, so that's going to bring to even lower levels, right up into their 60s and 70s possibly, as mixed age couples.
Thank you. That was my last question that you came in on.
Oh,
so
good.
It's absolutely fine. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Steve Darling.
Thank you, and I'll encompass like a series of questions all in one just to try and keep us on track with time. So clearly, in recent months, we've seen changes around eligibility for winter fuel payment, and that has had an impact on claims quite significantly for pension credit. We've seen some thoughts around that rush and that what happened there and how that worked out for you as advisors. Also, we've seen a significant change of it going up from about 20% being refused to half all applications being disallowed. Reflections around that would be really helpful. And the fact that half of these pensioners were refused, when one bears in mind it's quite often difficult to get somebody of a certain age to apply for a benefit, what is the long-term impact on people's going back and trying again for appropriate support, whether it's under pension credit or under other opportunities of support for people of pensionable age?
I think it wasn't a very well targeted take-up campaign. The World Fuel Payment, it tended to induce panic, so people claimed who weren't eligible, and that's why you perhaps got the high refusal rate, or one reason for the high refusal rate. The other thing, it was just about pension credit. If you get a disability benefit, so attendance allowance, or if you're a carer, you can get extra bits in pension credit, but that's often missed. When you phone the pension credit helpline, they're not advisors. They should just accept a claim from anyone, but you do sometimes see gatekeeping on that line because they wouldn't be eligible for the basic level of pension credit, but perhaps because of disabilities or caring, they would be. So it needs a more nuanced bit of take-up, which brings us back to where local and people who know you and know that you've got a disability think, well, actually, maybe we need to look at a disability benefit as well. It's much, much broader than just fill in this claim, and that's and Gareth's thing on the dangos as well. Just getting people, be a hairdresser or whatever, who knows the problem you have getting through the door and sitting in the chair or whatever, might say, actually, you should think about other benefits as well. So it's just much broader, so that just that panic, you're losing your winter fuel payment, isn't particularly effective in my view.
I think that's one of the effects of directing so many people towards pension credit, which I think was done out, as Daphne says, almost out of desperation for many people, was firstly it led to a predictable but not acted on delay in making payments and dealing with claims. I mean, we were up to 15, 16 weeks delay, which I think discredited the system somewhat. And I think our experience is that if somebody applies for a benefit that they've been told they might get and they don't get, their trust in the system is damaged, and they are far less likely then to come back. We could go back to these people next year and say, okay, you claimed last year but you didn't get it, but we think you could now. They won't believe us. And I think that's a significant issue. The previous panel, somebody mentioned trust, and I think that's a really important factor, that if you put if somebody fails with a claim, you've got to work doubly, triply hard to get them to claim the next time, even of a different benefit, be that housing benefit, council tax support, attendance allowance, or whatever. Their trust in the system treating them fairly is damaged.
I think, interestingly enough, we might have a lesson to learn from that. There's lots of evidence, lots of research that says people worry a lot more about losing something than about the possibility of gaining something. And I think that explains the number of non-qualifying claims that were made. People thought, oh, there's something there that I might not be able to get now, so perhaps I should try claiming it. And maybe we should think about using that kind of approach more broadly and take up a use it or lose it campaign rather than a this will make you better off campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Moving on now to David Pinto-Jaczynski.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that discussion. Talking about kind of take up and issues related to that. Obviously, the government also has announced its intention to merge the application process for pension credit and housing benefits for new claims in 2026. What do you see as the main risks and benefits arising from this?
From the local authority side, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding this, and we could only be a year away from it. We don't even yet know where that merger will take place. Will it be Department for Work and Pensions taking over housing benefit, or will it be housing benefit services taking over pension credit? Even that hasn't been clarified. So I think that has to be resolved very, very quickly. Trying to do this at the same time as we're moving into local government reorganisation in many areas and moving from two-tier systems to unitary authorities. There's a lot of work to be done there, and I think that would be playing around with housing benefits at that point is not going to be a popular factor, I think, in many local authorities. I think it could work towards promoting a better income for many pensioners. It could. However, when we look at the experience of some of the universal credit take-up, there's been a significant drop-off of people simply going, actually, you know, I don't want to do this. So we could end up not with more people claiming, but actually a drop-off of those who do. And saying, well, I'm on pension credit, or I'm on housing benefit, I don't want to claim pension credit, I'll drop off my housing benefit. And that, I think, could happen.
And I think the hope is that claiming, if you like, the two separate elements of support as one would increase the amount of take-up. I mean, housing benefit for pensioners is not well taken up, but it's better taken up than pension credit is. My own hope would be that they would move it into local authorities rather than into the DWP, because again, as Daphne said, that local knowledge of circumstances, of the awareness of what it's like living in that area, the very contact that local authorities have with people in that situation has got to be better than, you know, another post office box number somewhere in the country that DWP are going to treat it all as a paper claim.
Can I just add in an opportunity, I think, that could be there? So I mentioned earnings before. Housing benefit has a taper. There's a very small earnings disregard, but then there's a taper. So your earnings aren't all taken into account, whereas under pension credit, they are once you get beyond that very basic work allowance. So I would hope if they do that, that they would see it as an opportunity to bring a taper of earnings into pension credit, so that earnings actually meant more as a pensioner, that there was some worthwhile, you know, it was worthwhile to have a job. You would be better off for having one, whereas currently pension credit doesn't really have that.
The thing will be here to work out how to reconcile the two different eligibility.
Yeah, but I'd hope they'd go towards the housing and perhaps increase the earnings disregards as well, but certainly bringing the taper there. So that's an opportunity that's there, I think. But I agree that with what Gareth and Gary have said about the other issues that might come up.
Thank you. Mindful of time, Madam Chair, I'll
Thank you. Frank McNally, that's very good of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just following on from David's question there, can I ask you, do you consider it appropriate or advantageous to integrate claims for other benefits, and are there any that you would be keen that we focused on, or the Department of Work and Pensions and government more widely focused on?
I think this is, I mean, I mentioned before possibly making sort of the carer question a question on the pension credit, so you don't have to do a separate claim for carers allowance. I think that's an easy win, an easy simplification. I think there could be questions on it about disability as well, which might at least prompt a claim, you know, encourage somebody to do claim attendance allowance. I think it'd be hard to bring it in as part of the claim because it's quite a different benefit. The other thing I'd like to see much more on is the transition from working age to thing. So if someone's on universal credit, you've got them there, that's your opportunity to help make sure they put in their pension credit claim. There's a lot of messy transitions from universal credit up to pension credit. Sometimes universal credit doesn't stop, which causes confusion, so then they don't claim, and that's for both single people and mixed-age couples. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done. It's a bit outside your question, but on that transition to try and make it smoother, almost that you could automatically go from one means-tested benefit to another as you move from working age to pension age.
I think I would look at attendance allowance, and I certainly think it's worth exploring the possibility that where a local authority, social work department, social care department is doing a full assessment on somebody's care needs, that isn't triggering a attendance allowance claim for. I'm not saying it should be the only way, because there are going to be some people who would qualify for attendance allowance who don't qualify for local authority services and don't qualify for an assessment, so they should still have a separate route. But I think it's you wouldn't devise a system where a social worker or an occupational therapist or somebody else comes round on a Monday to assess you for your social care needs, and then somebody comes round from the DWP on Tuesday to ask you effectively the same questions. So I think there's certainly scope at least looking at that, but not making it the sole route, but a route on. And I think you could then simplify and bypass a lot of the issues, because once attendance allowance is awarded, you've then got the chance to look again at pension credit because of the way the severe disability premium works within pension credit. So I think there's a lot that can stem from promotion around attendance allowance in itself.
I think you have to differentiate between a claim made once for many different benefits and actually merging benefits into something with a single kind of claim process. There's an attraction in trying to claim lots of different benefits at the same time with one set of information. But when you look at it in detail, the really granular detail underlying the rules of all the benefits, there are so many differences between them, different ways of calculating income, different periods you average it over, different dates you need to claim by, different definitions of who counts as a close relative for all sorts of benefits. You really have to rewrite the whole benefit system to make that work, lots of primary legislation and secondary legislation. But taking the information you know about people and using it as an indication of potential entitlement, of pointing them where to go, of pushing advice to people. And that's the real problem that we have. In terms of advice services, we spend our days trying to respond to problems that people have got. What we don't do enough of, we haven't got the resources to, is pushing information to them that might stop those problems arriving, that might tell them where to go in the first place. And that's the real area where I think investment would pay huge dividends into business cases, making people more aware, getting there before the problem comes up, advising them in advance of what might happen next year or the year after when they reach pension age or when they stop working.
Local authorities when I used to work in a local authority, we did a take-up campaign every single year, and there's just not the resources now. And that, local authority, all advice services have been cut, and that used to be a big part of it. And that, it's firefighting now more rather than doing that really good, preventative take-up work, which is just we used to raise huge amounts. And you'll have the same experience, won't you, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking in my authority, and I know others are doing the same, at the links with public health, for example, that there's a strong public health correlation between the work that we would do in advising people and the outcome that could have. Again, we heard it from the previous panel in terms of hospital admissions, reductions in even just reductions in GP visits is something that I think you can measure. That if you give people an adequate income, the savings in the NHS, the savings through public health, I think are measurable if we really put our minds to it.
Poverty causes ill health causes poverty. You have to break that somehow.
Thank you all very much. I'm conscious that you have touched on some of the areas I was going to explore further, so I'll hand back to yourself, Chair.
Thank you so much. Danny Kruger.
Right, thanks, Chair. I've got two questions. I'll just tell you what they both are, but and then we can come back to the second. Just ask the first person, so you don't all need to speak to both of them. My first is just on this take-up question. I mean, there's obviously a essential conflict in government. DWP and all of us might want to ensure 100% take-up of pension credit, but that would cost billions of pounds. Presumably, the Treasury is actually banking on a failure of universal take-up of pension credit. They don't want 800,000 people to suddenly be claiming it. Not quite sure what the solution to that challenge is, but I wonder whether, it's probably not appropriate that every single person does claim it. There might be good reasons why some people are not, even if they were fully aware of their entitlement. But given that some people definitely should be getting it who aren't, and we've got this challenge with take-up, and I recognise all the points you've been making about the relational approach, face-to-face is best. Nevertheless, are there ways to automate the process, to use data more intelligently to identify the people who would be who are either most in need or who are the ones who are simply not claiming who could? That's my first question. My second one is very struck by Daphne's point about particularly women in midlife who are squeezed between caring responsibilities for older parents and their own grandchildren. Do you think there's more that we can... I mean, those people are saving the taxpayer a fortune. They're doing it sacrificially. You know, they're sacrificing their own income to do so. Is there more that we could do to reflect caring responsibilities both in the tax system and in the benefit system? Do you think as a society we could be doing more to acknowledge the contribution those people are making through tax and benefits? So those are my two questions. On the first one about using data better, who wants to take that?
You did the tax one, but I was going to do the first one.
I'll take the one on data, if I may. Yes, there's an awful lot that you can do with data in terms of identifying potential claims, potential help that's needed for people. What you can't do, I don't think, for many reasons, is to automate the whole process of then awarding the benefit. But the real problem comes from once you've identified where you think there might be a potential for take-up, how you then approach those people. It's back to, well, if it's an envelope dropping through the door, that's not going to do the job. You need to find a way of getting, as Gareth says, face-to-face. So you're using that data to target the people, but then you have to have the resources to actually get to them, to approach them.
I just wanted to not in on the data bit, but take-up saves money. I know on the DWP budget there'll be some more money, but we said it, we heard it in the other panel as well. There'll be less on the healthcare, less on the social care, because the more they've got, the more they can eat properly, heat their house, there's going to be less problem.
Just quickly, Daphne, it's not cashable savings, those. Yes, okay, so it's not a cashable saving for the budget holder, so that NHS bed will just be filled by somebody else. Yes, somebody might be costing the state less money themselves, but the state doesn't save.
God, I'm not good enough on the arguments like that, but you're going to have then shorter waiting lists, aren't you? Because there's things. So there's a shorter waiting list, then there's going to be less ill health in the population as a whole. One of the reasons for the rising sickness is because there's big waiting lists in the health service, and so people are sick for longer and can't get back to work. So, I mean, the trouble is it's one huge, great big circle, isn't it? So it's very hard to identify those savings and whatever, but I do think it's the whole domino effect that goes round and round. So I think there are savings, and also it's better to have a healthier population. So if those people have enough money to live and to eat, and maybe they socialise better because they can get their taxi to their local club that they go to, whatever it is, then those are all improvements, and you can't quantify them in the same way. But that happiness thing, we could be like Finland if we do that.
It's commercial as well. I mean, your £1 extra in benefit expenditure is not £1 extra out of the public budget. I mean, if you give £1 to somebody wealthy, well, they may spend it in the Seychelles, they may save it. Give it to somebody on benefits, and they're going to spend it straight away. Yeah. They're going to spend it much more locally and better off people. So that money goes into the local shops, it supports local jobs, it pays VAT, it comes back, it goes through NI. A lot of that money comes back to the government. It's not a £1 out, nothing back in. It's a £1 out, quite a lot of it back in.
That's the basis of any take-up campaign, but it brings a whole lot more money into the local economy.
Yeah. Good argument. Okay, great. So
can I just come back on the automation point? I think it would be lovely if we could do that. Where would we get the data from? In order to calculate means-tested benefits, we would need access to people's bank accounts. It would need access to their rent. It would need access to details of their non-dependents, people living with them. It would need a level of data that I think would deter many people from coming forward rather than encourage them to. Because of I mean, Gareth alluded to it, that the complexity of the information that we would need to automatically say, we have done all the work and you are entitled to £17.23 a week pension credit. It would be lovely, but I can't see people would give consent to that level of intervention into their personal private affairs. It's one of the reasons people are reluctant to contact the DWP, because they have greater trust in their local authority, thankfully, with housing benefit than they do with the DWP in terms of security of data.
Okay, all right, for powerful point, thank you. Just so on my second question about how we can sort of reflect the sort of household economy and caring responsibilities better in the tax and benefit system?
I think there are some issues there that we can promote more heavily. There's the carers credit that's available for national insurance to boost people's national insurance record, which would boost their income in retirement. There's the one I never get the name of, right, the child care credit that you get if you're a grandparent caring for, can somebody help me with the name of
Guardians?
No. Yeah, that one. There's, I think we could be looking at the criteria for carers allowance itself, 35 hours a week. Yet we award carers credit at 25 hours a week. And is there scope for looking at that so that we make it easier for people to qualify for carers allowance? And of course, changing the income rule for carers allowance. And thankfully, it is changing from April. But possibly it could go a lot further.
I would promote removing the earnings limit in carers allowance. Carers allowance is a very small payment. It saves the government a huge amount in care homes. If somebody wants to work a little bit and can fit it in around their work, that might be their respite to get out and go to work. Why is there an earnings limit in carers allowance? Really, there is just no need for it. And it's caused all this distress with the overpayments. It just shouldn't be there. That's my view.
Right, Denny?
That's right.
Thank you so much. Amanda Hack.
Give you that one.
Thank you. We've talked about this already, actually, and it's about the power of face-to-face support over other bits of support. So, what extent do you think the provision that we have meets the demands of what we need on face-to-face?
And there are huge deserts as well. I mean, so some areas have a much better advice, but I mean, as the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors, we see it all the time, and people just going down to like one or two people, you know, in an office or something, and trying to sort of manage it, and then they're having to resort more to phone or online because of that. And there's nothing better than face. Well, for some people actually that's not true. Some people prefer phone or online. I wouldn't want to take that away, but face to face is so important, and the provision just isn't there. And I go back to it. It saves money. Funding advice. I mean, they'll probably come on better for that, me. But funding advice workers bring so much more money into the community, and then that gets spent locally. But they'll argue it better than me. So
I think it's interesting that my own authority, Hertfordshire, is a relatively wealthy county, but the county council has put priority into funding advice services because they've seen what we do, and we bring in about £25 million a year in extra benefit income. And that is cumulative, so it builds up over time, but we bring in 25 million extra each year. And so our local authority has put resources into that. Unfortunately, I would say a lot of local authorities who are as wealthy as Hertfordshire don't see the need, and those authorities that do see the need don't have the money. And I think that's where we've got this imbalance, and as Daphne says, it creates deserts of I mean, some of the poorest boroughs in the country don't have a local authority welfare rights service anymore. And I think that's certainly something that, certainly through NAWRA and other organisations, that we'd be very, very conscious of.
NAWRA is pushing in its 50th birthday year for statutory advice duty this year.
I should declare I'm also on the NAWRA committee as well.
Yes, it's a good bit of NAWRA.
I'm not.
But you're a NAWRA member.
Oh, yes.
I mean, I think the case is that, like so many areas, the problem we've got is that local authorities and other budget holders look at this year's spend. Mm-hmm. They don't look at being able to, to the invest to save bit, as it used to be called. Spending money on benefits advice now solves some problems, quite a lot of problems immediately for people, but it doesn't save you as much money this year as it will save you, the health service, education service, everything, the year after year after year. And for sad reasons, local authority budget holders look at this year.
I think it may be something we come on to, but the Household Support Fund, which has been, well, we're now on to Household Support Fund 7, shows how entrenched it's becoming almost in local authority support. And it's done some wonderful things. However, the priority we've always been given in the allocation has been spend it on direct support. Don't spend it on advice work, spend it on direct support. As a result, we've given out literally millions of pounds in vouchers. But in my authority, our target, if you like, when we're doing advice work, is for every £1 we spend on advice work, we bring in £15 in additional income for people in poverty. Now, we can give out £100,000 worth of vouchers, and that will cost £100,000, and people get £100,000, zero sum. Give the advice sector in my authority £100,000, and we will bring in 1.5 million. And I think that's been one of either the fault and an example of how short-sighted some of the information has been and the guidance has been around household support fund.
And it's when it's given for such a short space of time, you can't plan ahead. People need to have budgets you need to be able to recruit people and retain people. I mean, that's another thing, getting people into the advice sector, because there's no sort of permanent jobs, no security, and people need that. People want to do it, but it's not particularly well paid, and it's not very secure. She just haven't been in it all her life.
I would point out there the difference in approach that the Welsh Government has to advice work, and they've set up a national advice network and regional advice networks, but next week or the week after, the next round of their single advice funding comes in, and that's set for 3 years, which is a huge difference for people who are supported by it, to have that confidence, to have that ability to plan a little bit in advance.
Indeed. Just a really quick question on the help to claim scheme. So we've got help to claim scheme on universal credit. Do you think there's something to introduce along similar lines for pension credit?
Yeah, it could be, but definitely with the face-to-face. So help to claim started with face-to-face, and the service is not the same as it was, and that's no disrespect to the people doing it, but you cannot give the same level of support online and over the phone. And it was a much better service, a much more holistic service, met needs of more people when it included face-to-face. And it just took away the local knowledge as well, because now if you do it, you speak to somebody, it could be anywhere in the country, whereas even when it was local and it was phone there, it was people who knew the services locally. They could if you needed more than help to claim Gareth, they could do direct referrals and things like that. So it's coming back to that local and knowing and face-to-face over and over again, I think.
Thank you.
I'd suggest as well that pension credit isn't as complex as universal credit. It doesn't need the same kind of level of support. But what it doesn't have is that integration with other sorts of advice about retirement income. And if pension-wise, for example, was to take in pension credit as well and talk about an integrated view of income in retirement, that would be a big advantage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Damien Egan, he's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. The clock's ticking, so we've got to solve the next one. We're going to focus on attendance allowance and back to the household support funds. Just before I do, I'm going to do the worst thing that I hate politicians, kind of making assumptions based on speaking to limited people. So I'm going to based on 2 people and one of it my nan, so I'm going to caveat that. Just to tell you, are there a group of people that you come across who, although they know they would be entitled to benefits, maybe feel proud of the fact that they haven't claimed in life, and so it's quite a leap then to almost have that on your mental record?
I think it's a real reason, but all the research shows it's a tiny, tiny way down the list of reasons why people don't claim. People don't claim because they don't know the benefits there in the first place, or they don't think they're entitled to it. That's the real kind of worry. I don't think the pride bit is so important. What is important is the scroungers bit, the kind of the tabloid media campaigns that have said, claiming a benefit is scrounging. That frightens people away. That worries them socially.
I think going back to when I did direct advice a bit more, I did see that, and you'd have to sit down with someone and say, no, this is your right. You've paid into the insurance system all your life. This is your entitlement. And so getting that across, and then also with attendance allowance particularly, oh, I manage. You'd always hear, oh, I manage. Well, how do you manage? And then they'd come out this long story about how long it took them to get out of bed and how they fell sometimes and whatever. You think, well, you're managing very well, but I think, whatever. And then also the fear of thinking if they got attendance allowance, they would have to have someone come in and help them. So if they said they needed help with their bath needs or their toilet needs, somebody was going to come and help them. No, you can spend the money on getting your net curtains cleaned if you want. That's fine. It's your choice. It's your money. So that's not understood. If people are putting in personal care issues, then they're worried somebody's going to come and help them, and they don't want that. They want to do it on their own.
I'd take it one stage further. I think some people would then be worried that they'll be taken away and put into a residential home, not just the carers coming in. They'll be taken out of the situation that they're comfortable with, even if they're struggling. You had your nan, I had my former mother-in-law, and eventually I persuaded her to claim attendance allowance. Because when you talk to her about getting dressed, I manage. Now, she managed by dressing like a 14-year-old. She wore tracksuit bottoms, a hoodie, and a pair of trainers, because that was all she could put on.
I'm going to try some of those lines. Attendance allowance, just on the name itself, comes up a lot.
Wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any ideas of what you think it could be called?
They think they're the carer if they're getting attendance allowance. So the name, the questions, the fear it does, the sort of, the feel that they're charity, and it's not, it's your right. So all those things need to be, which is why the personal touch helped, because I used to be going to visit people in their own homes. We were lucky we had a well-sourced advice service in the council, and we did home visits, so that's much more nice than having to go out somewhere, sit and have a cup of tea with them and take your time and go through it, and then they trusted you, build that trust, and then you could take it further. But you have to get through that barrier.
Especially when you're asking very personal questions.
Very
You're going in and asking somebody, can you wash yourself? Can you dress yourself? Can you go to the toilet by yourself? Can you bathe yourself? Those are very personal questions, and you need to have built up some degree of relationship with the person before you can get on.
Briefly, we've got 2 minutes. I need to support household support funds. How easy is it for us to, because we've talked a bit about it, but how easy is it to kind of compare and contrast what different councils are doing and the confidence that we've got that they themselves are kind of doing that performance monitoring so that they're getting the best outcomes from that money?
2 minutes.
Yeah.
It's been a very good sticking plaster over the cost of living crisis, but it's been a very big sticking plaster, and it's been very worthwhile. So I'm not going to knock the principle behind the Household Support Fund, even the amounts, despite 12.5% less this year. I had to mention that. My treasurer would never forgive me. But I think what we've seen is short term. My own local authority was told 2 weeks ago what money it was going to get from the 1st of April. You can't plan when you're given that lead-in period. And I think what it's done, it's enabled local authorities to dodge a bullet, frankly. And there's a great deal of concern about what happens next. And each time we've been told, after HSF 3, we were told, well, there won't be a 4. After 4, there won't be a 5. After 6, there won't be a 7. Well, here we are. And is there going to be a HSF 8 next year in April 26? We don't know. And if there isn't, where do we go with the demand that is now almost built in? We've almost created an assumption that certain support will now be provided, not away from pensioners, but be providing meals during school holidays using that money. Parents now expect that to come from their local authority because they've had it nearly 5 years. What happens when we can't?
I'll point out just very quickly that, of course, in Wales it's the Discretionary Assistance Fund, which is set up to be a much more long-term arrangement and manages to avoid the kind of the postcode lottery that different local authorities in England will be facing.
Maybe we should move to Wales instead of Finland.
I second that.
Safer as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for helping us with the time as well. And this concludes our oral evidence session for pension and poverty inquiry number 4.
Thank you.
Order.